scent was the first thing Ben Travis registered, as it always was. Diesel fuel clinging to his denim jacket, the sweet rot of silage hanging heavy on the humid air, and the sharp, clean smell of dew-dampened earth for 35 years. That cocktail had been the perfume of his life, his comfort, the soundtrack of his predictable universe. This morning, the temperature plummeted unexpectedly. The end of October delivered a chilling, wet gray cold that brought a cruel, biting frost. The gravel driveway crunched beneath the heavy leather of his work boots, a rhythm as familiar and unthinking as his own heartbeat. But the rhythm was off. A vital absence shattered the morning symphony. Ben stopped halfway between the porch and the barn, his breath fogging out in thick white plumes that hung motionless in the still air. He twisted his head, isolating the absence. It was the silence. It was too quiet. There was no nervous, high-pitched bleating from the main sheep pen. By 6:30 a.m., the flock was usually a cacophony of demanding noise. Even the magpies, normally raucous scavengers already tearing at the last withered stalks of field corn, had withheld their screeching. This was not peaceful silence. It was heavy, suffocating, like being sealed inside a glass jar. The land itself held its breath. He pulled the collar of his coat up and kept walking, his unease crystallizing into something sharp and cold in his stomach. He headed toward the far pasture, past the rusted skeleton of an old hay rake his father had left behind. That pasture housed the older, heavier stock, the ones too expensive or too old to sell off. That was where Jenna was, a massive, lazy Holstein, the thickest cow he owned. He saw the dark shape just ahead of the perimeter fence. Ben dismissed it initially. He knew Jenna often slept right there, wedged against the lowest wire, catching the slight warmth radiating from the soil. But as he drew nearer, a new sensation pushed through the chill of the morning. A thick, immediate warmth in the air, a pocket of heat that did not belong. It was the unmistakable heat of raw carnage. He broke into a trot. The cow lay still. She was definitely not sleeping. As he stepped over a cluster of muddy, frozen thistles, the true horror of the scene pressed against his senses. The smell was not just blood. It was dense, metallic, an overwhelming stench of iron that eclipsed the familiar smells of manure and wet peat. It stained the surrounding earth, making the ground appear impossibly black. Jenna's body had been dismantled with frightening precision. Her spine was grotesquely twisted, her hind legs bent back at angles that defied bone structure. This was not the messy, hungry work of coyotes or stray dogs. This was mechanical, focused destruction. The flesh had not been torn away for consumption. The structure had been broken down. It was an act of terrible, efficient violence, a message written in sinew and bone. Ben stood frozen, his skepticism fighting a losing battle against the horrifying evidence before him. Bears ripped. Wolves gnawed. Even the biggest mountain lion tore the throat out and dragged the body away, leaving a clear trail of struggle here. The ground was barely disturbed, save for the massive pool of blood collected beneath the unnatural curve of Jenna's torso. He looked for tracks. Nothing in his 40-plus years of farming had prepared him for what he found embedded in the soft, loamy soil bordering the tree line, about 10 feet from the fence. The soil here was damp and easily impressed, a mixture of clay and decaying leaves. Ben knelt slowly, the metallic smell burning his nostrils. The print was wider than any wolf track he had ever seen, possessing a distinct, almost human-like heel. 4 toes ended in deep, wedge-shaped depressions, like something razor-sharp had been driven straight down. He measured the depth with a calloused finger, 2 full inches. Jenna weighed over 1,200 pounds. The creature possessed the sheer muscular force to twist the cow's spine like a dish rag, and its colossal weight was confirmed by the sheer depth of the impression. Yet the step stride was impossibly long. He used his shovel handle to measure it, finding nearly 4 feet between heel prints. The distance between the prints and the lack of corresponding drag marks or scuffed earth established the beast moved with an unnatural, gliding lightness at a lope. It was a contradiction in physics. The silence that began the morning was malignant. It was not the absence of sound, but the deliberate erasure of it. Ben, a man who built his life on observable facts, on the dependable logic of harvest cycles and animal husbandry, felt the familiar ground shudder beneath him. This creature shattered every category his rational mind possessed. It destroyed a 1,000-pound animal in utter silence, with impossible strength, and left behind tracks that spoke of a nightmare blended with human form. He did not reach for the phone immediately, did not call Jenny Rhodes, the sheriff. He simply stood, hands resting on the shovel handle, desperately trying to jam the brutal reality into the pigeonhole labeled natural world. But the edges were ripping, and what peered back at him was anything but natural. The knowledge settled on him like the freezing fog. This was not a predator. This was an incursion. He stayed there for another 5 minutes, simply staring at the 2-inch depressions in the clay, until the cold finally drove him back to the barn, the heavy, coppery smell of the earth clinging to his clothes like guilt. The rest of the morning's work, the milking, the feeding, the checking of the generator, felt thin and fragile, a pretense of routine erected against the certainty that something terrible had broken loose in the sheltered folds of their familiar valley. Sheriff Jenny Rhodes arrived around mid-morning. She was a woman built like a brick outhouse, with a weary face molded by 20 years of rural police work, but her eyes, perpetually squinting in the glare of the sun or the gloom of dawn, were razor-sharp. She knelt by Jenna's corpse, chewing on the inside of her cheek. "Mountain lion, Jenny," she announced, her voice flat, devoid of conviction. "A big one. It is rabid." "Lions eat, Jenny," Ben said flatly, pointing to the mangled spine. "Lions do not do carpentry, and they do not weigh enough to press a track 2 inches deep in clay, not even running." Jenny stood up, brushing dirt from her reinforced trousers. She conceded the point with a slow nod, but still defaulted to the known. "We have a freak, then. Perhaps a pack of ferals. I will send out a deputy to start patrolling the eastern perimeter tonight, and I will put a notice out for heavy traps." Ben did not argue further. He knew the fight he was facing was not with Jenny, but with reality itself. The truth was unspeakable, so they stuck to the speakable lies. Mountain lions, rabid dogs, or some crazy satanic cultist, anything but the print he had photographed on his phone. That impossible blend of human heel and lethal claw. 2 miles east, the Rowell family, whose farm was known for its prize-winning Dorper sheep, vibrated with nerves after hearing the rumors about Ben's cow. They did not need scientific proof to feel the dread. Fear, like water, always seeks the lowest ground. The Rowells acted defensively. They installed a camera rig, military-grade infrared, focused directly on the narrow gateway to the specialized holding pen where their most valuable stock slept. They felt a certain grim satisfaction setting it up. If anything came, they would have evidence. The creature came on the second night. The Rowells did not hear anything, not over the drone of the heat lamps and the protective sounds of the penned animals. It was not until the next morning, when they checked the feed, that the truth became visible, yet utterly incomprehensible. Ben and Jenny watched the playback on the Rowells' ancient, flickering monitor in their kitchen, the stale air thick with the smell of old coffee and fresh panic. The first few minutes were standard infrared static, a shimmering greenish-white image of the quiet pen. Then it happened. The entire incident lasted 15 seconds. A shadow, not a shape, but an active absence of light, dropped into the frame from above the roofline. The speed was impossibly high, the trajectory airborne and ending abruptly. The shadow momentarily filled nearly the entire screen, giving no clear outline, only a suggestion of bulk and terrifying velocity. Just as the shadow made contact with the ground, the camera registered a single sharp sound. It was not a growl, nor a gunshot. Ben described it later as a wet, heavy snap, like a thick branch of green wood being instantly broken, but muffled and deep. Then, absolute silence. The shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared, melting back into the blackness of the night. The sheep pen was empty. No frantic scatter. No wool, no blood visible in the infrared wash. Nothing. A flock of 30 high-grade dorpers had simply ceased to be there. The violence was so swift, so clean, it defied understanding. The next morning, Ben went into the empty sheep shed, armed with a powerful tactical flashlight, looking for what the camera had not shown. The smell hit him first, and it was worse than the copper tang at his own fence line. This was not the usual rankness of a predator's territory. It was aggressive, almost industrial. It smelled like ozone after a lightning strike, a sharp, clean electrical burning, overlaid with the acrid stench of raw, stagnant copper. It was the smell of something metabolized beyond the natural world. Ben found the residue, a thin, viscous slime coating the surface of the feed trough where the creature had landed. It was not urine or feces, but something concentrated and volatile. It felt sickly warm to the touch. The psychological damage to the surrounding community was immediate and profound. It was not just the cattle and the sheep. It was the sheer efficiency of the disappearances. People started doing things they had not done since the last major blizzard 20 years ago. They nailed plywood over windows, checked the weight of their shotgun shells, and most damningly, they started locking doors with heavy iron bolts. The kids, usually running wild and unsupervised in the evenings, now slept jammed into their parents' bedrooms, evening social gatherings, the heart of their isolated farming life, were cancelled. Fear was no longer a philosophical concept. It was the cold draft sliding under a locked door. The recurring motif of absolute silence amplified the terror. The nights were deep, inky black, and utterly soundless. The kind of stillness that pressed painfully against the eardrums. Furthermore, the local radio stations, usually audible but weak, were now choked by a furious, constant static, a background sizzle that felt less like atmospheric interference and more like a deliberate act of jamming. Ben sat alone in his living room, the hunting rifle leaning against the stove. He reflected on the silence. It was not just the quiet before the storm. It was the quiet of the hunter, the intentional muting of the environment so that only the sound of the ultimate final act of destruction would register. The horror was in the creature's preparation, its patience. Ben looked out his window at the oppressive darkness. He realized the silence was not a lack of sound. It was the sound being actively suppressed, held down by an unseen, enormous weight, only to be released in a terrifying, wet snap when the life was extinguished. And every night, that weight grew heavier. The town tried to cling to routine, but the fabric was tearing. People drove faster, kept their eyes on the rearview mirror, and spoke in low, hushed tones about the stray dogs, trying to convince themselves the menace was four-legged and dim-witted. The illusion ended with Terry Stanford. Terry was 14, a spindly kid known for his boundless energy and his habit of spending the late twilight hours on his mountain bike, cruising the muddy fire trails that skirted the pine woods he had been told to stay inside. But the reckless spirit of adolescence, the conviction that nothing truly bad could touch him, had won out. He did not make it back for supper. His bicycle was found on the main logging trail at dusk, leaning against the thick mottled trunk of an old ponderosa pine. It was neatly parked, as if Terry had intended a brief return. Sheriff Rhodes, her face etched with a new, weary grimness, organized the search party. A dozen men, armed with rifles and flashlights, walked alongside Ben, who was now solely focused on the ground. Ben walked the perimeter slowly, pushing through the thick undergrowth, his eyes scanning for the impossible print he had seen at his farm. The ground here was slightly firmer, rocky gravel mixed with pine needles, making tracking difficult. Yet, about 50 yards from where the bike rested, he found what he was looking for: long, disproportionate strides, the familiar, deep impression of the heavy heel, the 4 wedge-shaped toes. They led directly away from the path, into the thickest, blackest part of the young timber. Ben stopped the search party and knelt. The tracks were clean, deliberate. There was no sign of a scuffle, no pine needles scattered violently, no snapped saplings that would indicate a panicked struggle. "He did not fight," Ben muttered, standing up. "The kid did not even struggle." The absence of struggle was the most terrifying fact. A human should fight, a trapped animal would scream. The total lack of evidence established, Terry was simply lifted, cleanly, instantly, off the face of the earth, as easily as picking up a doll later that night. Back at the makeshift command post set up in the town hall, Ben found Jenny staring blankly at a crumpled map of the county. The metallic smell, that ozone copper stench, seemed to be following them now, faint but persistent, like a chemical presence. "We need to stop calling this a natural disaster, Jenny," Ben said, his voice quiet, almost exhausted. He looked at the sheriff, noticing the profound fear that had finally extinguished the skepticism in her eyes. "I know what I saw in that shed, and what I saw in those tracks, and now the kid." He spoke slowly, articulating the thought that had been solidifying into granite dread in his own mind. "This is not about hunger. A bear tears, a lion bites, a wolf pack shares. They need calories. They leave remains. This thing, whatever it is, destroys, or it takes the whole thing away. It is an act of elimination, not sustenance." Jenny looked up, her expression strained. "You are talking about something smart, Ben." "I am talking about something that is calculating," Ben corrected, his gaze drifting back to the trajectory of the tracks in his memory. He returned to the most chilling detail he had noticed on the forest floor, a detail he had not yet shared. The path Terry had taken was littered with obstacles. A large, shallow puddle fed by a slow creek overflow, and a thick, moss-covered log lying across the trail. The creature, despite its colossal stride, stepped around the edge of the puddle, placing its heavy foot carefully on the dry dirt. It chose to step cleanly over the fallen log. "Look at the way it walks, Jenny," Ben pressed. "If it was an instinct-driven beast, it would barrel through everything, leaving chaos in its wake. But it avoids the mud. It steps over obstacles when it could easily crush them. It is moving to reduce its physical signature. It is not instinct, Jenny. It is caution. It is calculation." The realization hung between them, heavy and suffocating. A monster they could fight. A strategic, thinking entity that stalked them. That was something else entirely. It elevated the terror from a physical threat to a mental siege. For the community, Terry's disappearance was not just a tragedy. It was the definitive end of their isolated, protected world. The fear that had been creeping in at the edges now stood solidly in the center of their living rooms. It was no longer abstract. It had weight, it had claws, and it chose its victims with precision. Jenny spent the rest of the night poring over the maps, tracking the 3 incidents: Jenna, the Rowell's sheep, and Terry. She overlaid Ben's description of the tracks with the time of the attacks, and a chilling pattern emerged. Every incident occurred just outside the range of the sporadic patrols she had established. The creature was not just reacting, it was observing their defense patterns. It was learning faster than they were adapting, like a chess master playing against amateurs. As the late-night silence descended again, broken only by the crackle of the police scanner trying to pull in distant signals, Ben looked at the map, seeing not fields and forests, but a targeted territory he knew, with a certainty that froze his blood, that they were not the hunters. They were the ones being tracked, their movements anticipated, their defenses systematically dismantled. He arrived quietly, without fanfare, around noon, driving an old, beat-up 4x4 pickup truck with tires that looked capable of crossing a river. He pulled up next to Ben's truck outside the general store, stepped out and surveyed the street, noting the hastily boarded-up windows and the general air of nervous decay that now hung over the small town. The man was tall, stringy, with the kind of sun-leathered face that suggested long years spent looking at distant horizons. His name was Robert Hale. He was not introduced as a tracker or a hunter, but his hands, visible as he rested them on the truck bed, were a roadmap of old, intricate scars. His eyes were the most unusual feature. Unnervingly calm, the kind of eyes that had seen the worst things the world had to offer and had simply catalogued them. He did not ask about Terry Stanford or the Rowell's sheep first. He went directly to Ben, recognizing the quiet authority and the deep trauma in the farmer's eyes. "Show me the tracks," Hale requested, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Ben took him out to the pasture where Jenna had met her fate. Hale did not carry a camera or tape measure. He knelt by the indentations, not looking at the overall shape, but running his long, sensitive fingers over the ridges and the depth of the clay. He was only interested in the evidence of displacement. When he stood up, he looked directly at Ben. "You are calling it a bear? Or a wolf?" "We are trying to," Ben admitted. Hale nodded, not judging, just stating fact. It is an alpha, not a nickname, not a fairy tale. It is the top of the food chain, evolved past the need for caution. It possesses muscle density that is not sustainable and a metabolism that must burn through energy at an impossible rate. It is not magic, Mr. Travis. It is biology pushed to its absolute limit, anchored by a consciousness that rivals yours. Ben felt a terrible, cold confirmation settle in his chest. Hale was speaking the truth Ben had only dared to think in the darkness. Hale avoided words like magic or curse. He framed the horror in clinical, terrifying terms. It does not hunt to sustain itself in the traditional sense. It eliminates competition and marks territory. It is studying you. It is learning your patterns faster than you can establish them. Hale then moved on to analyze the pattern of the attacks. He listened intently to Jenny's description of the infrared footage and Ben's observation that the creature avoided unnecessary obstacles. It uses contrast, Hale explained, pulling a worn piece of chalk from his pocket and drawing a diagram on a dusty barn door. It attacks during the full lunar cycle, when there is maximum light, but that bright visual spectrum is used to heighten the contrast of the shadows. It makes the observer focus on what they can see, so they miss the entry and exit points, which are always cloaked in absolute darkness. And the silence, it uses it as a weapon. It creates sensory deprivation, so that when the single final explosive sound comes, the wet snap, it is overwhelming, debilitating. It is psychological warfare. The presence of Robert Hale, who spoke of this monster with the detached certainty of an epidemiologist discussing a virus, offered a strange, brittle hope. He gave the terror a label, a structure, which made it marginally less overwhelming than the unknown. But his absolute confidence that they were dealing with a conscious, strategic opponent made the dread exponentially deeper. Hale quickly dismantled Jenny's existing security plans. Traps will not work. Patrolling is pointless. He already knows your routes. We must change the game. We need to stop trying to defend and start trying to provoke. We must create a controlled, highly visible but geographically constrained space. We need to show him that we are dictating the terms of engagement, that we are not retreating. This will draw him in, because he views control as absolute. He called it an inversion. They would concentrate their assets and their vulnerability in a single point, instead of dispersing them across the territory. They would become the bait. We need to bring the conflict to a head, Hale said, his eyes hard and unwavering. He sees you as an occupying force. We have to make him commit a mistake. Ben felt a renewed, terrible certainty. Hale spoke of a rational enemy, one that could be mapped, studied, and baited. But in his heart, Ben knew that the creature's intelligence was the very thing that made it unbeatable. Rationality on that scale, coupled with that level of physical power, was simply a force of nature. And no farmer ever truly beat the weather. They just tried to survive it. That evening, the first shipment of construction materials arrived, ready for the ambitious, terrifying project. Building a fortress designed to fail, purely to observe the failure. The low roar of the heavy machinery, cutting through the unnerving silence, felt both defiant and utterly futile. Robert Hale calculated that the Alpha, having established its dominance in the western section bordering the forest, would continue to expand its territory outwards, adhering to the known vulnerabilities of the area. The creature's first act of defiance against Hale's arrival was to invalidate that calculation immediately. The Roll farm, the scene of the previous devastation, was hit again. It was a clear, unambiguous response to the new authority. The Alpha was demonstrating that it, not the new expert, still held the power of initiation. Jenny Rhodes, Ben, and 3 other farmers, men who had seen enough to replace fear with a sort of cold, stubborn resolve, were concealed in the old Rowell hayloft, built high into the ceiling of the main cow barn. The air was thick, suffocating, smelling overwhelmingly of dried alfalfa, dust motes, and the sharp, coppery sweat of anticipation. They had been waiting since 9 o'clock. The moon, full and round, climbed high, casting the field in silver-white clarity. Hale's theory was simple. The light would draw the beast into the shadows. It was close to 2 in the morning when the heavy cloud cover drifted in from the west, swallowing the moon and extinguishing the world. The silence that followed was abysmal. The creature did not burst from the tree line, nor did it drop from the roof. It coalesced. One moment, the darkness beneath the large, leaning silo was pure shadow. The next, it held a definitive, terrible bulk. It simply was there. Ben gripped the cold wood of his rifle stock, his knuckles white. The creature was gargantuan, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more if it stood fully erect. Its form was muscular, unnaturally smooth. The fur was a matte, absolute black that devoured the moonlight, making its contours hard to define. Ben saw the monstrous shift of muscle across its massive shoulders and the thick, mobile power in its haunches. Crucially, it was not making a sound. It did not stalk or prowl. It stood utterly motionless, its head lowered slightly, processing the environment. Ben focused on the eyes. In the deep shadows, they did not glow red or green with reflected light. They were an unnerving pale yellow, and the pupils were long vertical slits, radiating cold, absolute concentration. There was no rage there, no primal, hungry madness, only surgical focus. It was the look of a scientist observing a Petri dish. Jenny whispered the command, a rasping sound in the deep, quiet fire. The sudden eruption of sound was deafening, a physical blow that filled the barn and bounced off the corrugated metal roof. 3 high-powered rifles and 2 smaller caliber rifles spat fire, the blinding muzzle flashes momentarily illuminating the creature in strobing, awful clarity. The sharp, bitter scent of gunpowder instantly overpowered the scent of hay and fear. Ben watched, horrified, as the rounds connected. He saw the coarse black hair twitch and ripple where the high-powered ammunition struck. There was no corresponding sound of pain. No howl, no grunt, no staggering retreat. The creature did not flinch. It did not react like flesh and blood struck by a bullet. It reacted like stone struck by hail. It held its position for perhaps 3 seconds while the men frantically cycled the bolts. Then it moved. It was not a run. It was a single monstrous leap that spanned the entire 20 feet between the silo and the main barn wall. The air compressed and then snapped back into place behind it. One moment it was there. The next, it was gone, absorbed by the darkness behind the heavy, concrete silo tower. "Cease fire!" Jenny yelled, her voice hoarse, her rifle still smoking faintly. Silence returned, but this time it was fractured, ringing with the ghost echoes of the gunshots. They waited, listening to the terrified, rhythmic breathing of the men around them, but the night offered nothing back. They crept out cautiously, Ben swinging his powerful tactical light across the ground where the Alpha had stood. He searched every inch of the trampled grass and dirt. He found ejected brass casings, spent rounds flattened against the cement floor. But he found no sign of the creature. There was no blood, not a single drop. The force of the bullets had been absorbed entirely by the creature's immense, specialized mass. The concept of its invulnerability settled on them all, heavy and cold. The next morning, Hale, who slept in a tent several miles away and arrived at dawn, examined the scene with Ben. He went straight to the heavy steel rolling door of the cow barn which faced the silo. Ben's flashlight revealed the damage. Deep gouges marred the thick steel, not claw marks, which would have been fine and precise, but blunt, massive indentations, as if someone had jammed the sharp, heavy edge of a chisel into the metal and then pressed down with 5 tons of force. He did not run, Hale observed, running a scarred finger over the crumpled steel edge. He jumped behind the silo, realized he was not hurt, and then left his mark on the building before moving on a declaration. The creature decided the fight was inefficient. It communicated its supreme indifference to their weaponry and then moved on. The reconnaissance mission had not confirmed their strength. It merely demonstrated the Alpha's unchallenged supremacy. They had fired everything they had, and the monster had simply moved the conversation elsewhere. Back at the town hall, Robert Hale spread a large topographic map of the county across the worn oak table. He used red thumbtacks to denote the locations of every attack: the cows, the sheep, Terry Stanford's disappearance, and the recent failed ambush at the Rowell farm. The pattern, once visualized, was terrifyingly clear. All the incidents were clustered tightly in the western quadrant, along the boundary line that separated the old farmland from the deeper, federally owned forest preserves. This particular area had seen recent contentious land sales. Several desperate farmers, unable to make ends meet, had sold their peripheral tracts to a consortium planning a high-end tourist lodge and luxury subdivisions. Hale circled the core area of concentration with a thick marker. It is not hunting for food, and it is not attacking randomly. It is systematically clearing its territory of incursions. The animals were collateral. Terry was a reconnaissance kill, eliminating a potential witness or messenger. The second attack on the Rowells was a response to your presence. He tapped the map with a precise finger. This creature views humanity as an invasive species. You are not prey. You are an environmental threat. He is not consuming. He is securing his borders. He is eliminating the threat of development. He is pushing you out. The idea was met with stubborn, angry refusal by the few remaining farmers assembled. They could accept a monstrous, rampaging animal, a beast of instinct. They could not accept a monster that read the local land registry and strategized a planned, brutal eviction. You are telling us this thing is worried about property values? One farmer scoffed, his voice tight with disbelief and fear. I am telling you it recognizes a threat to its dominion, and it is acting with extreme prejudice to remove it, Hale stated calmly. It understands permanence. It understands long-term settlement. It is saying, this land is no longer yours. Ben, however, found a strange, cold logic in Hale's assessment. It explained the lack of consumption, the strategic silence, the tactical movements. If the Alpha was a thinking strategist, every move it made, however horrific, was geared toward achieving its ultimate goal: total human withdrawal. The paradox of the hunt deepened. If they could not kill it with heavy rifle fire, how could they stop it? We cannot kill it through conventional means, not unless we drop an artillery shell on it, Hale admitted. But we need to prove its intent. We need to force a sustained engagement, not just a brief flash of violence. If he wants us off the land, we give him something he must defend against. Hale's final plan was audacious and cruel. Gather all remaining highly valuable livestock from the surrounding farms, the last vestiges of their livelihood, and concentrate them into a single, fortified pen directly in the perceived center of the creature's protected zone, several miles into the woods, closer to the high ridge. It was the ultimate lure, the densest, easiest target, completely exposed. The ultimate provocation. The preparation for the great bait took 3 days. The atmosphere was electrically charged. Men moved in a focused blur, fueled by coffee and desperation, not speaking unless absolutely necessary. The pungent smell of new lumber, fresh asphalt sealant, sweat and diesel fumes mingled. The smell of a civilization attempting its final stand against something wholly outside its understanding. They reinforced a cattle pen with railroad ties and heavy-gauge steel fencing, hauling in a massive diesel generator to ensure continuous blinding light. Ben worked side by side with the others, but felt profoundly disconnected. He stood on the land his family had worked for generations, the soil that held the bones of his ancestors, yet he felt utterly alien. His confidence, his ownership, had evaporated. It was not his land anymore. It belonged to the silent, massive thing that dictated its will in claw marks on steel doors and impossible tracks in the frozen mud. He looked at the map again, seeing the small, isolated squares representing their farms. They had always been taught that they were the masters here. The apex of the local ecosystem. Now they were just parasites, waiting to be scraped off the skin of the earth by a far superior organism. The coming fight was not for survival, Ben realized, but for dignity. A final futile assertion of their failed dominion. The night of the final stand was bitterly cold, the temperature struggling to stay above 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was still, heavy, and carried the scent of pine and impending snow. The reinforced corral stood bathed in the aggressive white glare of 4 massive floodlights, powered by a throbbing diesel generator positioned 50 yards away. Behind a thick curtain of brush, the noise of the machine, constant and mechanical, was the only thing standing between them and the overwhelming silence of the forest. Ben, Jenny Rhodes, and the 3 remaining armed men sat shivering on the flat roof of a hastily constructed shed overlooking the enclosure. They were tense, watching the perimeter where the intense light met the solid, inky blackness of the trees. The designated time for Robert Hale to join them came and went. He was supposed to be positioned half a mile to the south, setting up a secondary visual observation point. Jenny, her nerves frayed taut, dispatched 2 men, armed with walkie-talkies, to check on his position. The men returned 10 minutes later, breathless, their eyes wide with terror. Hale's old pickup truck lay flipped onto its side in a shallow ravine, the heavy door torn clean off its hinges. The ground showed large, deep drag marks leading away toward the mountain ridge. Robert Hale was gone. Panic, cold and suffocating, seeped into the remaining 4 Hale, the man who understood the Alpha, the source of their strategic confidence, had been eliminated from the equation. The hope they had clung to vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The Alpha struck seconds later, not at the expected point of confrontation, the brightly lit corral, but at their vulnerability. The light did not dim or flicker, it simply died. The loud, insistent rhythm of the diesel generator, the only sound of civilization and life in the silent night, cut out with devastating abruptness. The world plunged into an absolute disorienting darkness, thicker and more oppressive than natural night. Ben understood instantly. This was not luck or a short circuit, this was deliberate. The Alpha bypassed the bait, avoided the armed men, and targeted their only advantage. It approached the generator from the deep woods, silent, and destroyed the machine with a single calculated act of force. This was not a creature of rage. It was a tactician. The attack came from the eastern flank, the side they had deemed most protected due to the steep embankment there. A short, guttural scream ripped through the absolute darkness, a sound Ben would carry like a tumor in his memory for the rest of his days. It was a choking, wet, truncated noise, belonging neither to a desperate man nor a triumphant beast. It was the sound of life being abruptly, violently evacuated from a body. "Fire! Fire at the sound!" Jenny roared, blindly discharging her shotgun into the void. Ben followed suit, emptying his rifle in the direction of the terrible noise, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the scene like a strobe light, briefly showing the frantic, terrified silhouettes of the men around him and the outlines of the huddled cattle in the pen. The exchange lasted perhaps 90 seconds. The air was choked with gunpowder smoke, and the darkness seemed to vibrate with terror. Then, silence returned. Not the strategic silence of the predator waiting, but the stunned quiet of the prey realizing their utter helplessness. When they managed to coordinate their flashlights, pointing the weak beams toward the source of the noise, they found Mary Smith, one of the 3 remaining farmhands, gone. 2 other men were on the ground, one clutching a shattered femur, the other bleeding profusely from his side. The wounds were deep lacerations. The Alpha had not attempted a general massacre. It executed a single targeted extraction, demonstrating its complete mastery of the situation. It took a hostage, wounded the others, and left them alive, not out of mercy, but out of calculated superiority. It was saying, "You came to fight, I took one of yours. The rest of you are irrelevant." Ben knelt beside the wounded man, the metallic stench of fresh human blood mixing with the lingering ozone smell of the Alpha. The cold, logical dread returned, sharper than ever. The creature had not killed them because it did not need to. It established its point, extinguishing their light, stealing their partner, and shattering their meager defenses with surgical precision. They had provoked the Alpha, and the Alpha responded by taking their leader and their comrade. They had lost everything in under 2 minutes of total darkness. The search for Robert Hale commenced at first light, conducted by Ben and the 2 least injured men, their movements clumsy with exhaustion and shock. Jenny stayed behind, trying to coordinate the immediate medical evacuation of the wounded and dealing with the overwhelming shame of the defeat. It took Ben nearly a full day to find Hale. The trail of the deep, heavy drag marks led them high into the ridge, past the timberline, and into an area of sharp, gray granite outcroppings. Hale was not dead. He lay near a large, moss-covered slab of rock, deliberately positioned. He was awake, shivering violently despite the mild afternoon sun, his face smeared with dirt and shock. The most disturbing detail was his clothing. Hale's jacket and shirt were ripped open, but his skin underneath showed no lacerations, no sign of claw marks puncturing the surface. Instead, he had massive dark bruises covering his torso and ribs, marks consistent with immense pressure. The four-toed outline of the Alpha's massive paw prints were clearly visible on his skin. Pressed deep into the flesh, he had been crushed, not pierced. "He did not kill me," Hale whispered when Ben knelt next to him. His voice was cracked, raw. He never intended to. Hale confessed that he was not merely an expert tracker. He was a former security contractor who worked off the books for a decade, investigating similar patterns of inexplicable disappearances, mostly tourists and hikers, near the high ridges of the mountains farther north. He encountered the creature's tracks and its pattern 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it cornered me in a ravine, Hale recounted, his eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point. I was armed, terrified. I thought my path was ended. But it just stood there, watching me. Then it knocked my rifle away, crushed the barrel, and left it did not touch me. He finally understood why he had not been destroyed this time either. I am not a farmer. I am not a settler. I am an observer. The creature perceived me as a neutral element in the equation. It did not eliminate me because I was not a direct threat to its claim on the territory. Hale slowly sat up, wincing, and pointed toward the overturned truck where he'd been ambushed. He did not kill me, Ben. He eliminated Mary. He flipped my truck. He left me here, dazed but alive. I was a delivery system for a message he could not articulate. The message is, do not bring your experts here. Do not bring your knowledge. Get out. The Alpha, Ben realized, was not just strategically attacking. It was strategically sparing. It utilized the trauma of the survivors to propagate its will. The fear they carried would do the creature's work for it, convincing everyone else to flee. Then Hale shared a more elemental, physical horror. While he was immobilized, pinned down by the creature's weight, he felt something beneath the earth. The ground was vibrating, Hale said, staring down at the granite, deep, continuous tremors. Not natural, not a quake. He confirmed the Alpha was not confined to the surface. It disappears too quickly. It appears too far away from the last sighting. This is not speed, Ben. This is topography. A system of caves or abandoned mining tunnels runs beneath this entire range. The Alpha utilizes the geology of the land for movement and concealment. It moves underground, emerging exactly where and when it chooses. This knowledge transcended Ben's previous understanding of the threat. It was not just a physically superior animal. It was an opponent that utilized a third dimension, a deep subterranean network to achieve its goals. The horror deepened, shifting from the known terror of a land-based predator to the intuitive, primordial fear of the darkness beneath their feet. They could not fight what they could not find, and if the ground itself was a weapon, they had no chance of survival, much less victory. They were facing an enemy that held the entire landscape in its grip, above and below. The remnants of the community, reeling from the elimination of Mary Smith and the terrifying reappearance of Robert Hale with his story of subterranean movement, began their final preparations for withdrawal. They were broken, their spirit decimated. Evacuation was imminent. Ben, however, could not bring himself to pack. He stayed on his farm, moving through the desolate ruins of his life. He cleared the scattered debris from the skirmish, working in the cold silence. The metallic, coppery smell the Alpha had left behind had permeated the wood and the stone, forever staining his property. His wife and daughter were already packed and waiting at his sister's house, 30 miles away. He had promised to follow by morning. But as twilight deepened into night, a profound, chilling sense of necessity drew him out. He left his rifle leaning against the kitchen counter. He wore only his heavy jacket and work gloves. This was not bravado. It was a desperate final need for clarification. He had to see the architect of his destruction one last time, face to face, without the interference of gunpowder, fear, or false hope. He walked toward the small, familiar ridge bordering the forest, the place where he had first seen the colossal footprint months ago. The night was thick and wet, the air still and heavy with moisture. When he reached the apex of the hill, he stopped. The Alpha was there. It stood absolutely still, silhouetted against the slightly less opaque sky, an enormous, dark figure, seemingly carved out of the surrounding blackness it was not hiding. It was waiting, asserting its presence, like a sentinel whose command was uncontested. Ben stood there, the icy wind whipping around him, chilling the sweat on his neck. He raised his eyes to meet the creature's gaze. In the deep, profound darkness, with no reflected moonlight, Ben saw the eyes again. This time they were not pale yellow, they were not reflecting any light at all. They were two vast black pits absorbing every stray photon, utterly devoid of depth, of warmth, of anything remotely empathetic. It was not the predatory hunger of a wolf. It was the chilling, impersonal gaze of a geological formation. This was not a creature looking at food. It was a landlord inspecting a trespasser. Ben did not move, and neither did the Alpha. There was no growl, no flecks of aggression, no display of teeth. The creature's existence was the only argument it needed to make its silent presence was the complete and final statement. Ben felt a terrible, cold flood of understanding. He had always been a rational man. He based his life on measuring risk, calculating yield, understanding opposition. Here, the calculation was simple. The enemy was fundamentally unbeatable. The war was unwinnable. The choice was not between fighting and fleeing. The choice was between rational surrender and pointless, fatal sacrifice. The Alpha showed him his fate through Mary Smith and the ruined generator. He would be eliminated with clinical efficiency if he stayed. It showed him its will through Robert Hale. He would be allowed to survive only if he left and spread the message. Ben took a deep breath, the cold air scraping his lungs. He felt the vast weight of his own defeat, but he also felt the strange lightness of certainty he was a small, fragile thing in the face of this terrible, organized power. Slowly, Ben turned his back on the silent hill. He walked away without looking back, knowing that the Alpha's eyes, those two black, bottomless voids, were fixed on his retreating figure. The creature did not follow. It made its point. It gave Ben the one, final, unarguable choice: acknowledge its sovereignty and disappear. As he walked back down the slope toward the faint, welcoming yellow glow of his kitchen light, Ben felt the last vestiges of his self-regard peel away. He was going to live, but only because the monster allowed him to. And that, he realized, was a defeat more profound than a physical ending. The morning dawned gray and desolate, but the air felt scrubbed clean of the terror that had saturated the previous nights. The decision had been made. The fight abandoned the community gathered at the intersection of Ben's Farm Road and the main county track. They were loading up the remnants of their lives, whatever could be salvaged and driven away. 5 pickup trucks and 2 aging flatbed haulers were slowly being filled with essential furniture, boxes of photos, and the heavy tools that defined their working lives. No one spoke about the Alpha or Terry or Mary Smith. They talked about the weather, about the cousin they were going to stay with in the next state, about the price of feed down south. They used banal chatter as a shield against the crushing weight of the unspoken reality. They were running away from something that had simply decided they did not belong. Ben walked slowly through his empty farmhouse. The air was thick with the lingering scent of a life now packed away. Dust motes dancing in the weak light, the sharp fragrance of lavender his wife used to dry in the pantry, and the lingering sweet smell of the pipe tobacco he had smoked every night on the porch. These were the physical evidence of a past that had been ruthlessly excised. He found Jenny leaning against the kitchen counter, wiping her face with a bandana. "Ready, Ben?" she asked, her voice flat. He nodded, running his hand over the chipped porcelain of the sink one last time. He then turned to face the dozen people gathered outside, the remaining farmers, their wives, their shell-shocked children. He did not offer encouragement or call for future resistance. He simply stated the inevitable truth, quiet but weighted with the authority of the defeated. "We cannot win this," Ben said, looking at their broken, tired faces. "We have spent too much time trying to fit the world into our logic, but the rules have changed. It is not a fair fight, and it is not a fight we were ever going to survive. We can only leave." The admission of total, unequivocal defeat was the hardest thing he had ever spoken. But it was born not of cowardice, but of the cold, clear logic that had defined his life as a farmer. He assessed the threat, weighed the cost, and recognized the absolute superiority of the enemy. It was the only rational choice left. The caravan began to move, a slow, mournful procession of tired engines and heavy chassis churning up plumes of red, dry dust on the gravel road. It looked exactly like what it was, a funeral march for a way of life. Ben drove his old, dented flatbed following the taillights of Jenny's squad car. He reached the main highway where the asphalt began and glanced into his side mirror. The hill where he had stood last night, the high point overlooking his pasture, was clearly visible. And there, standing utterly still, was the massive, dark silhouette of the Alpha. It was immense, motionless, a monument of black marble erected by the new sovereign. It watched them go. Ben did not speed up. He did not try to outrun the image in his mirror. He simply drove. His last thought, as the familiar landscape of his lifelong home receded into the dust cloud behind him, was one of terrible, inverted clarity. They had always believed they were the masters of this land, the logical, civilized pinnacle of the food chain, the settlers, the owners. The Alpha was not a monster in the classic sense. It was the re-establishment of a natural order they had forgotten existed. It had not come to destroy them for pleasure. It simply put them back in their place, revealing that they were, in the end, nothing more than ephemeral intruders on ancient, unforgiving ground. They had not lost a battle. They had simply been eliminated from the territory they never truly owned. And now, the land was finally quiet again, just the way the Alpha wanted it.